Captain Lisa Morgan stood on the bridge of the New Dawn and watched the stars grow strange. The ship trembled as they moved deeper into the abyssal reach. This was the place where the Galactic Council had sent humanity to die. The place they called uninhabitable. The place that was supposed to be their grave. She thought about that last day on Earth Station. Katie Reynolds had stood before the council wearing her best diplomatic uniform. Her voice had been steady as she spoke for all of humanity. The elven High Counselor Lirelei Moonwhisper had listened with cold eyes. Her pointed ears had not moved even once. Her silver hair caught the light as she shook her head. The Crystal Queen, Vexalia, had spoken next. Her voice rang like broken glass when she said humans were too dangerous, too wild, too unpredictable for peaceful space. The aquatic matriarch. Keyleth had agreed with flowing hand gestures. Her blue skin shimmered as she declared humanity a threat to galactic harmony. Katie had tried to argue. She had shown them human art and music. She had talked about human kindness and love. She had begged them to reconsider. The council had voted anyway, exile, complete exile to the one place in the galaxy where nothing could survive. Lisa remembered, watching Katie cry as the final vote was announced. The ambassador had spent 10 years building relationships with these species. 10 years learning their languages and customs, 10 years believing that understanding could bridge any gap. It had all been for nothing. Now Lisa guided her ship through space that defied logic. Gravity pulled in impossible directions. Time moved differently here. The ship's instruments screamed warnings about dark matter storms and spatial tears. Chief, Engineer Amanda Clark worked frantically at her station. Her hands moved across the controls with desperate skill. The New Dawn was not alone. 300 other human ships had been forced into this exile. Some carried families, others held scientists and engineers. A few transported the last pieces of human culture and history. All of them were supposed to die here within days. Amanda suddenly looked up from her console. Her face was bright with discovery. She had found something in the chaos. The dark matter here was not random. It had patterns. It responded to certain frequencies. She began adjusting the ship's shields to match these patterns. The ship stopped, shaking. The alarms went quiet. Lisa felt her breath return to normal. They were not going to die today. Amanda had found a way to swim with the current instead of fighting against it. The chaos around them became a protective blanket. Other ships began copying their shield modifications. Captain Rebecca Stone of the Horizon sent grateful messages. Commander Nicole Price of the Defiant reported that her engines were actually running better in this strange space. The anomalies that should have killed them were somehow making them stronger. Lisa received a transmission from the colony ship Sanctuary. Dr. Megan Foster was reporting strange readings from their medical bay. The dark matter exposure was not harming the colonists. Instead, it seemed to be changing them in subtle ways. Improving their reflexes, sharpening their minds, making them more aware of the space around them. Days passed and more discoveries came. Engineer Tracy Adams found that the spatial distortions could be used for communication. Messages could travel instantly across vast distances by riding the chaos waves. Dr. Jennifer Cole discovered that the gravitational anomalies contained massive amounts of energy that could power their cities for centuries. The humans began to build in this impossible place. They learned to anchor their stations between dimensions. They created homes that existed partly in normal space and partly in the void between realities. Children born here seemed naturally adapted to the environment. They could sense gravitational changes before instruments detected them. Lisa watched her people transform. The exile that was meant to destroy them was making them into something new. Something the galaxy had never seen before. The abyssal reach was becoming their strength instead of their weakness. She thought about the council members who had condemned them. They lived in their perfect worlds with their perfect technologies. They had never faced real hardship. They had never been forced to adapt or die. They thought they were superior because their lives were easy and controlled. But humans had always been different. They had climbed out of caves to reach the stars. They had survived ice ages and asteroid impacts. They had fought wars and made peace and learned from both. Chaos was not their enemy. It was their oldest friend. the new dawn found its new home, in a region where 3 different gravitational fields created a stable pocket. Other ships joined them. Soon they had a small city floating in the void, the first human settlement in the abyssal reach, the place where their new civilization would begin. Lisa named it Haven, not because it was safe in any normal sense, but because it was theirs. Because they had earned it through skill and courage and refusal to die quietly. Because it was the first place in 50 years where humans could build their own future without asking permission from anyone. She sent a message to the other human settlements that were forming throughout the Reach. They would survive this exile. They would grow strong in this place of chaos and darkness. And someday, the galaxy would learn what it meant to cast aside a species that refused to stay down. The Abyss had become their home, and they would make it into something magnificent. 25 years had passed since the exile began. Dr. Megan Foster walked through the medical center of New Haven Station and marveled at what humanity had become. The children born in the abyssal reach were different from their parents. Better, in ways that still amazed her. She watched young Amy Chen practice in the training room. The girl moved through a complex obstacle course that would challenge any normal human. But Amy was not normal anymore. She dodged gravity wells that shifted, without warning. She leaped across gaps that opened and closed in space itself. Her movements were fluid and natural. The chaos around her was as familiar as breathing. Commander Nicole Price led these new humans in the Defense Forces. She had been born on one of the first colony ships during the Exodus. Now she commanded squads that could navigate the most dangerous regions of the Reach. Her soldiers fought practice battles in conditions that would kill ordinary people. They treated impossible physics like playground rules. Nicole herself could sense gravitational changes from miles away. She could feel the dark matter currents that flowed through local space. When she flew her fighter through an asteroid field that existed in 4 dimensions at once, she moved like she was dancing. The ship responded to her thoughts as much as her hands. Captain Rebecca Stone had expanded her original settlement into a major hub. Her engineers had learned to build with materials that did not exist in normal space. They grew crystal structures from compressed time. They wove energy fields into solid matter. Their cities were works of art that defied every known law of physics. The most gifted among them was engineer Tracy Adams. She had designed the Grand Nexus, a station that served as the capital of human space in the Reach. The structure existed, in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. Visitors from normal space could only see a tiny fraction of its true size. To them, it looked like a simple research station. To humans who had adapted to abyssal physics, it was a sprawling metropolis. Dr. Jennifer Cole had become the leading expert on dark matter manipulation. Her laboratory was a place where thoughts became reality. She could reshape matter with focused intention. She had learned to store information in quantum foam and retrieve memories from the cosmic background radiation. Her work had given humanity abilities that seemed like magic to outside observers. But the most profound changes were in the children themselves. Megan had studied hundreds of them over the years. Their brains showed new neural pathways that allowed them to process multidimensional mathematics intuitively. Their nervous systems could detect quantum fluctuations. Their eyes could see parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that normal humans could not perceive. She thought about Lisa Parker, now 16 years old. The girl had been born during a particularly violent dark matter storm. Instead of being harmed by the exposure, she had absorbed its patterns. Now she could predict space-time distortions hours before they occurred. Ships throughout the Reach relied on her forecasts to plan their journeys. These abilities were not random mutations. They were adaptations. Humanity was evolving to thrive in an environment that had been designed to kill them. The abyssal Reach was changing them into something the galaxy had never seen before, something that belonged in the spaces between realities. The human settlements had grown into a thriving civilization. They traded with each other across impossible distances. They shared knowledge that combined science with intuition. They built technologies that worked by partnership with the universe rather than dominance over it. Their ships were marvels of adaptive engineering. Captain Helen Martinez commanded a vessel that could shift its molecular structure depending on local conditions. In normal space, it looked like a standard cruiser. In the deep abyss, it became something that resembled a living creature more than a machine. It could heal damage by absorbing energy from nearby quantum fields. General Rachel Clark oversaw the military development of these new humans. Her troops trained in combat scenarios that used the Reach itself as a weapon. They could cause spatial tears that would swallow enemy ships. They could create gravity bombs that would crush targets from multiple dimensions at once. They fought wars according to rules that made sense only to minds raised in chaos. But perhaps the most important change was in human culture itself. The exile had taught them the value of cooperation. They had learned that survival required everyone to contribute their unique gifts. The old Earth divisions of race and nation had been forgotten. What mattered now was adaptation and mutual support. Dr. Carol Thompson had documented these cultural shifts in her anthropological studies. The humans of the Reach had developed new art forms that existed in multiple dimensions. Their music incorporated frequencies that could only be heard in altered spacetime. Their poetry was written in mathematical equations that described the relationship between consciousness and reality. Megan often thought about the Galactic Council members who had exiled them, those proud species with their ancient civilizations and perfect technologies. They lived in static worlds where change came slowly and carefully. They had rejected humanity because humans brought unpredictability to their ordered existence. But that unpredictability had become humanity's greatest strength. While the Council species followed predetermined paths, humans had learned to dance with chaos itself. They had become masters of adaptation in a universe that demanded constant change. The long-range sensors began detecting new signals from Council space. Something was happening out there. Ships were moving in patterns that suggested panic rather than purpose. Communications carried desperate messages about unknown threats and failing defenses. Megan wondered if the galaxy was finally learning the price of casting aside those who refused to conform. The Council had wanted a universe of predictable order. They had rejected the species that brought necessary chaos to the mix. Now they might be discovering what happened when a system became too rigid to bend. The humans of the Abyssal Reach watched these developments with interest, but not concern. They had found their home in the void between worlds. They had become something new and wonderful in the darkness. Whatever was troubling the galaxy would have to face them eventually, and when that day came, the Council would learn what they had truly lost when they chose exile over understanding. Admiral Susan Blake stood in the command center of the Grand Nexus and watched the galaxy burn. The displays showed Council space collapsing sector by sector. The proud civilizations that had exiled humanity 50 years ago were falling to an enemy unlike anything they had ever faced. The void wraiths had come from spaces between dimensions. They existed partly in normal reality and partly in something else entirely. Council weapons passed through them harmlessly. Their ships could phase in and out of existence at will. They struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. Susan had watched the Battle of Andromeda's Gate through intercepted transmissions. High Counselor Lyralai Moonwhisper had led a massive elven fleet against the Wraith invasion force. Her graceful silver ships had moved with perfect coordination. Their energy weapons had carved beautiful patterns in space as they fired. None of it had mattered. The Wraiths had simply stepped sideways through reality and appeared inside the elven formations. Their dark weapons had drained the life from ships and crews alike. Lyralai herself had escaped only because her flagship had been equipped with an experimental phase drive that let it slip between dimensions for brief moments. Queen Vexalia had fared no better. Her crystal ships were marvels of geometric precision. They could focus stellar energy into devastating beams that could crack planets. But the Wraiths existed in too many dimensions for focused attacks to work. Her beautiful vessels had shattered, like glass against enemies that refused to hold still long enough to be targeted. The aquatic Tidecallers had tried a different approach. Matriarch Keyleth had used their natural harmony abilities to create unified fleet movements across entire star systems. Her ships had moved like schools of fish through space. But harmony required predictable patterns, and the Wraiths thrived on chaos that made their own seem tame. Now desperate messages flooded the communication channels. Refugees fled toward any safe harbor they could find. Some of them were heading toward the Abyssal Reach. They came not as conquerors or diplomats, but as broken survivors seeking shelter in the one place the galaxy had written off as uninhabitable. Captain Allura Vysoren led the first refugee fleet to reach human space. Her mixed force included elven survivors, crystalline Zephyrians, and scattered Tidecaller vessels. They had been running for weeks through space that grew more dangerous every day. Their ships were damaged and their supplies were running low. Allura was young for an elven captain. She had been born after the human exile and had learned about them only through council propaganda. She expected to find primitive survivors huddling in makeshift shelters. She expected to find desperate people grateful for any help the superior races might offer. Instead, her sensors detected something impossible. The abyssal reach was full of structures that should not exist. Space stations that occupied multiple dimensions simultaneously. Ships that moved through gravitational fields, like they were ocean currents. Energy signatures that made no sense according to any known physics. Her communications officer picked up a transmission from something calling itself Haven Control. The voice belonged to a human woman who spoke with calm authority. She identified herself as Commander Nicole Price and offered safe passage to designated refugee zones. Her tone suggested that she was doing them a favor rather than desperate people welcoming rescue. Zephyrian war leader Vexandra could barely contain her outrage. Her crystalline form pulsed with angry light as she demanded to know how primitive. Humans dared to treat their superiors like charity cases, but her sensors were showing the same impossible readings as everyone else. The humans were not hiding in corners waiting to be saved. They were offering protection from a position of strength. The refugee fleet entered the Reach expecting to find chaos and destruction. Instead, they found order of a kind they had never imagined. Human traffic controllers guided them through spatial anomalies with casual expertise. The paths their ships followed would have been impossible to navigate using council science, but the humans treated them like well-marked highways. Dr. Jennifer Cole met the refugees at Processing Station Omega. Her laboratory had been converted into a temporary medical facility. She examined the new arrivals with equipment that seemed to bend reality around itself. Her diagnostic tools could see through multiple dimensions, and her treatments worked by adjusting quantum probability fields. The refugees were amazed to discover that humans had not just survived in the abyssal reach. They had mastered it completely. Their technology worked by cooperation with natural forces rather than domination over them. Their cities were grown rather than built. Their ships moved by becoming part of the space around them rather than pushing through it. Captain Allura found herself assigned to a liaison role with the Human Defense Forces. She was introduced to Admiral Susan Blake in a conference room that existed in 7 dimensions at once. The human woman looked perfectly normal until you noticed that her shadow fell in directions that had no name, and her voice carried harmonics that touched parts of the mind that should not exist. Susan explained the situation with matter-of-fact calm. The Void Wraiths were indeed a serious threat to normal space. Their abilities to phase between dimensions gave them enormous advantages over conventional forces. But the abyssal reach operated on different rules entirely. Here, the humans had learned to fight on terms that would confuse even the Wraiths. As if summoned by her words, Wraith scouts began probing the edges of the reach. They had followed the refugee trail and now sought to continue their hunt in this strange region of space. What they found instead was their first real opposition since beginning their conquest. Human defense ships met the Wraith incursion with weapons that should not work. Captain Helen Martinez led a squadron that could shift between multiple realities, faster than the enemy could track. Her pilots fought battles that took place in 17 dimensions simultaneously. They used the chaos of the Reach itself as ammunition. The Wraiths had expected to find easy prey hiding in the cosmic wasteland. Instead, they encountered predators that had evolved to hunt in spaces between worlds. The dark creatures that had terrorized the galaxy found themselves outmatched by beings who had learned to swim in deeper darkness. Allura watched the battle from the Grand Nexus and finally understood what the Council had lost when they chose exile over integration. These humans had not been conquered by the Abyss. They had conquered it and made it into something wonderful and terrible and completely their own. The tide of war was about to turn, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The war for the abyssal reach began when the Void Wraiths realized they had found their greatest enemy. These dark beings had conquered half the galaxy by avoiding direct confrontation. They struck from the spaces between dimensions and vanished. before retaliation was possible. But humans had made those same spaces their home. Captain Helen Martinez commanded the human fleet from the Bridge of the Paradox. Her ship existed in normal space only when she wanted it to. Most of the time, it swam through layers of reality that had no names. Her crew included people born in gravitational storms and raised on quantum uncertainty. They fought wars, according to rules that made sense only to minds shaped by chaos. The first major battle took place in the Maelstrom sector, where space folded in on itself every few hours. Normal fleets would have been torn apart by the shifting geometry. But the Wraiths could phase through solid matter, and the humans had learned to surf the reality waves. Both sides could fight in conditions that would destroy any other species. Helen watched her tactical display show impossible formations. Her ships moved through 17 dimensions at once, while the enemy flickered between states of existence. Weapons fire traced patterns that would have driven Council observers insane. The battle resembled a dance performed by entities that belonged in nightmares. Engineer Lisa Parker had equipped the human fleet with reality-anchoring devices. These weapons could force the phase-shifting Wraiths into normal space, where they became vulnerable to conventional attacks. But the Wraiths adapted quickly and began using the Reach's own dimensional instabilities to hide from the anchoring fields. Dr. Carol Thompson led the ground forces defending human settlements. Her troops had trained in environments where gravity flowed like water and time moved in spirals. They could fight battles that took place across multiple timelines simultaneously. When Wraith infiltrators tried to attack civilian colonies, they found defenders who seemed to know their moves before. They made them. The climactic engagement came at the heart of the abyss itself. This was the deepest part of the Reach, where the barriers between realities had worn completely thin. Space here had geography that existed in 11 dimensions. Time fractured into streams that sometimes flowed backward. It was the one place in the universe where both humans and Wraiths felt completely at home. General Rachel Clark established her command post in a fortress that existed partially outside the normal flow of causality. From here, she could observe the battle across multiple probability threads and adjust her strategy based on events that might or might not happen. Her tactical computers processed information that came from futures that had not yet been decided. The Wraiths attacked with their entire remaining invasion force. Thousands of shadow ships emerged from the void between worlds. Their weapons could drain the life from stars, and their passage left tears in the fabric of reality itself. They moved like a plague of living darkness spreading across the impossible landscape of the heart. But the humans were ready for them. Captain Rebecca Stone led the civilian evacuation fleets through escape routes that existed in folded space. Dr. Megan Foster had prepared medical stations that could treat injuries to both body and soul. Tracy Adams had built defensive platforms that drew power from the breakdown of universal constants. The battle itself defied description in any language that referred to normal physics. Ships chased each other through mazes of twisted space-time. Weapons that fired cause and effect rather than energy beams carved wounds in the structure of existence itself. Warriors fought hand-to-hand combat while falling through dimensions that had no up or down. Nicole Price led her special forces through an assault on the Wraith command vessel. Her team moved through the enemy ship's corridors that existed in 7 different centuries at once. They fought defenders who could become solid or gaseous at will. The boarding action took place across a timeline that stretched from the birth of the universe to its eventual heat death. The turning point came when Jennifer Cole activated her experimental consciousness weapon she had learned to weaponize, the human ability to adapt and change. The device projected pure evolutionary pressure across multiple dimensions. It forced everything in its area of effect to either adapt or die. The Wraiths had spent millions of years as perfect predators. They had never needed to change or grow. When faced with the choice between evolution and extinction, they're static. Nature became their weakness. They began to fragment and dissolve as the weapon forced them to become something they had no capacity to become. Captain Allura Visorin watched the final moments of the battle from the bridge of her rescued Elven vessel. She had fought alongside human forces throughout the war and had seen them perform impossible feats with casual skill. Now she watched them defeat enemies that had seemed utterly invincible just months ago. The last Wraith ships fled back into the deep void between galaxies. They would not return to this region of space for eons if they ever returned at all. The darkness that had threatened to swallow all of galactic civilization had been driven back by people who had learned to make darkness their ally. Helen Martinez stood in the ruins of what had once been the heart of the abyss. The battle had changed even this impossible place. New forms of matter had been created by the collision of incompatible physics. Time itself had been rewoven into patterns that would take centuries to fully understand. But humanity had won more than just a military victory. They had proven that adaptation was stronger than perfection, that chaos could defeat order when order became too rigid to bend, that the species the galaxy had cast aside had become its greatest protectors. The refugees who had fled to human space began to understand what they were witnessing. These were not the primitive warmongers of counsel, propaganda. These were beings who had transcended the limitations that bound other species. They had become something new in the universe, something that belonged in the spaces where others feared to go. The war was over, but its consequences were just beginning. The old galaxy was dead, and something new would have to be built from its ashes. And at the center of that new order would be the humans who had made the impossible into their home. 5 years after the Wraith War ended, President Karen Davis stood before representatives of 100 species in the Grand Assembly of New Terra. The massive station existed simultaneously in the abyssal reach and normal space. Delegates could attend the session from either reality depending on their species' capabilities. The old Galactic Council was gone forever. Most of its member worlds lay in ruins, or had been abandoned entirely. The survivors had fled to human space not as conquerors, but as refugees, seeking protection from a universe that had become too dangerous for their static civilizations to handle. Karen looked out at the assembled delegates and saw the future taking shape. Captain Allura Visorin represented the reformed Elven collective. Her people had abandoned their claims to superiority and were learning to adapt rather than simply maintain ancient traditions. Queen Vexalia spoke for the Crystal Networks, Zephyrian city ships that now incorporated human chaos engineering into their geometric perfection. Matriarch Keyleth had brought her remaining Tidecaller fleets into full partnership with humanity. Her aquatic people had discovered that their natural harmony abilities worked beautifully with human intuitive physics. Together, they had created new forms of faster-than-light communication that could carry emotions and concepts along with simple data. But the most remarkable changes were in the humans themselves. Dr. Megan Foster had documented the continued evolution of her species throughout the post-war period. The children born after the Wraith conflict showed abilities that surpassed even their abyssal-adapted parents. They could communicate directly with quantum fields and perceive probability streams as clearly as visible light. Commander Nicole Price, now an aging veteran, served as head of the Interdimensional Defense Force. Her troops included humans, elves, crystalline beings, and species that had been discovered only after the Reach became accessible to normal exploration. They trained together in combat scenarios that would have been impossible before human technology opened new pathways through space and time. The new civilization was unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. Engineer Tracy Adams had designed cities that grew like living organisms. They adapted to local conditions and evolved new capabilities based on the needs of their inhabitants. Her greatest creation was New Terra itself, a mobile capital that could travel between star systems while maintaining perfect environmental conditions for dozens of different species. Dr. Jennifer Cole had become the first director of dimensional sciences. Her research teams included the brightest minds from across known space. They studied the fundamental nature of reality using tools that combined scientific method with intuitive understanding. Their discoveries were rewriting the basic laws of physics on a daily basis. Captain Rebecca Stone commanded the Exploration Corps that was mapping regions of space previously thought uninhabitable. Her ships could travel through dark matter storms and navigate gravity mazes that would crush normal vessels. Each expedition returned with new discoveries that expanded the boundaries of possible knowledge. The economic system of the new galaxy operated on principles of mutual benefit rather than competition. Species contributed their unique strengths to collective projects that benefited everyone. The elven gift for biological engineering combined with human adaptability to create living ships that could heal themselves and grow stronger through experience. Crystal manufacturing techniques merged with abyssal physics produced materials that could exist in multiple states simultaneously. Tide-collar harmony abilities enhanced human quantum manipulation to create technologies that responded to emotional states as well as conscious commands. Every collaboration produced results that none of the individual species could have achieved alone. Captain Helen Martinez led the diplomatic fleet that made contact with previously unknown civilizations. Her ships could approach alien cultures using whatever form of physics those species understood best. First contact became a process of finding common ground rather than imposing familiar concepts on unfamiliar minds. General Rachel Clark oversaw the Temporal Security Division that protected the new civilization from threats that operated across multiple timelines. Her teams included specialists who could perceive causality violations and repair damage to the structure of history itself. They prevented wars before they started and healed wounds that extended backward through time. Lisa Parker, now a woman in her 30s, had become the chief reality engineer for the entire human sphere. Her weather forecasts covered space-time storms that could affect entire star systems. Her early warning systems could detect threats emerging from parallel dimensions or alternate histories. She had made the impossible routinely predictable. But perhaps the most important change was in how the species of the galaxy saw themselves. The old council had been based on hierarchy and rigid classification. Some races were considered superior and others inferior. Some technologies were deemed primitive and others advanced. Everything had its proper place in an unchanging order. The new civilization embraced change as the fundamental force of existence. Species were valued for their unique perspectives rather than their position in some artificial ranking. Technologies were judged by their effectiveness rather than their adherence to established principles. Innovation came from combining different approaches rather than perfecting single methodologies. Ambassador Katie Reynolds, now elderly but still sharp, served as the historical advisor to the new government. She had lived through the exile and the transformation that followed. She often reminded younger delegates about the price of rejecting diversity in favor of false unity. The galaxy had nearly been destroyed by its own inflexibility. Dr. Carol Thompson documented the cultural renaissance that accompanied the political changes. Art forms emerged that existed in multiple dimensions. Music incorporated frequencies that could only be heard in altered space-time. Literature explored concepts that required mathematical notation to express properly. The creativity unleashed by mixing different species' perspectives was transforming consciousness itself. Admiral Susan Blake, now retired, lived in a small house on New Terra that existed partly in her memories and partly in quantum probability. She had seen humanity rise from exiled refugees to galactic protectors. She often sat in her garden, where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, and watched ships arrive carrying beings from the farthest reaches of known space. Her granddaughter, Amy, often visited to hear stories about the old days. The girl had been born between dimensions and treated impossible physics as easily as breathing. She could walk through walls when the mood struck her and had conversations with entities that existed only as mathematical concepts. Amy asked one day if her grandmother was angry at the elves and aliens for what they had done to humanity so long ago. Susan smiled and gestured at the thriving city around them. Ships from 100 worlds came and went through portals that led to every corner of the galaxy. Children of a dozen species played together in parks where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than commands. She told Amy that anger was pointless when looking back at necessary mistakes. The Council had feared human chaos and had tried to eliminate it by casting humanity into the void. But chaos was not something to be destroyed. It was something to be embraced and channeled and transformed into a force for growth and change. The Abyss had given humanity everything they needed to become who they were meant to be. They had learned to swim in darkness and make it luminous. They had taken the worst punishment the galaxy could devise and turned it into their greatest gift. They had become the bridge between what was and what could be. The exile was over, but the adventure was just beginning. Humanity had found its place in the universe not as conquerors or subjects, but as gardeners of possibility. They would help other species adapt and grow and become more than they had ever imagined possible. The galaxy belonged to everyone now, and everyone belonged to the galaxy. And at the heart of it all were the humans who had learned to call the impossible home.